Got it.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another evening of Northshire Presents. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person. I'm the events manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. Here, as I so often am these days, with my good friend and colleague, David Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester Center, Vermont. As you're coming in, you are probably noticing that this evening's presentation is being recorded for subsequent broadcast on our YouTube channel. However, fear not, if you want to have your video on, we have the settings arranged so that only those of us who are unmuted and speaking will be recorded for posterity. So you can have your camera on and we will not be putting you on our YouTube channel. In light of that, please use the chat box at any point throughout the evening to pose any questions that you have. We will be saving those up and we will pose them for you at the end of the night when we get to the audience question and answer session. David will be introducing our authors in just a moment, but one last note from me before I mute myself, which is a word of thanks. Independent bookselling is a crazy business, even in good years, and the last few years have not been good for any small businesses. And Northshire owes its continued success and its continued existence to the incredible loyalty and support of customers like you. We couldn't do this without you. And we wouldn't exist without you, and we are deeply grateful for that. So thank you so much for being here tonight and for your continuing support. Now, David, why don't you go ahead and introduce our guest tonight?
Thanks so much, Rachel. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome to Northshire David Chernikoff for his new book, Life Part 2, 7 Keys to an Awakening with Purpose and Joy as You Age. He trained as a yoga teacher with Swami Satchidananda, studied with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and deepened his commitment to meditation practice with Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, and Sharon Salzberg. After a long stint on the faculty of Naropa, he currently teaches retreats and workshops throughout the US and has a private practice as a spiritual counselor and life coach. Jack Kornfield said of Life Part 2, David offers a wise and loving vision for a gracious later life, full of many favorite stories and helpful teachings, while Sharon Salzberg said that each chapter is a stepping stone, and altogether they show a path to graceful aging and acceptance. We're lucky to be joined tonight by Nate Klemp, co-founder of the corporate mindfulness training firm LifeXT and a New York Times bestselling author, most recently of The 80-80 Marriage, which he co-authored. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Nate Klemp and David Chernikoff. Nate, why don't you take us away?
Well, first of all, it's so great to be here with all of you. It's a real pleasure to do this event. And it's an honor for me to be able to be the interviewer in this case. I'm going to be asking David Chernikoff a number of different questions about the book because I've known David for about a decade. And as you mentioned, I've written some books on mindfulness and I work in the field of mindfulness. And it's fair to say that much of what I have learned about both the study and the practice of mindfulness and meditation has come from my work with David Chernikoff. He's a mentor in my life and just a really important person for me. So I feel very honored to be able to guide us through this conversation. And I thought we would start with a question, David, about what is it that inspired you to write this book? Because it's not easy to write a book. It's a real risk putting yourself out in the world like this. And I would just love to know, what was the inspiration for Life Part 2?
Great question, Nate. And thanks to all of you from the bookstores and all of you who are here. It's just great to be together this way. There were several reasons I decided to write the book. One of them is that I've loved reading since I was about 4 years old. And I've been an avid reader throughout my entire life. And there was a certain point along the way where I realized what a joy it would be to give to other people in something even close to the meaning and happiness and joy I've experienced in relation to some of the books I've read. And although I never trained as a writer, I've always thought it would be fascinating to take on the challenge of trying to really organize and understand what I could share with other people that would hopefully be of benefit. Another part of this had to do with the fact that a few years back, I was approaching 70 years old, And I felt drawn inwardly in the sense of wanting to do a kind of life review. I had started meditation and spiritual study and service-oriented work from a spiritual standpoint when I was a 21-year-old college student. And I realized I was coming upon a certain kind of 50-year anniversary in regard to practicing meditation and studying spiritual teachings across a number of traditions. And I asked myself the question, what have I learned about how to be a wise and loving human being? And my sense was that if I could articulate that in writing, it would be a really helpful way for me to integrate what I've experienced and learned over the years of study and practice. The third aspect of it has to do with the fact that I've been very, very blessed in my life to have had the good fortune to study and practice with some amazing teachers, which were mentioned in the introduction that David did. And I feel such incredible gratitude to these teachers, and I wanted to express it in a way that I thought they would resonate with, even if they weren't physically alive at this point. And my sense was that I could express my gratitude for what they helped me to understand in my life by sharing what they taught me with other people. And I think it was the combination of those three reasons, if you will, that the motivation arose a couple of years back to answer the question, what have I learned about how to live a conscious life?
I love that, David. And, just to follow up there, I want to get to aging because that's such a central theme in your work and in the book. And just context here, I am 42 years old. I'm probably one of the younger people on this call. And yet this morning I woke up and I turned to my wife and I was like, I think I have bags under my eyes. Why do you think that is? And she said, because you're 42, Nate, you're getting old. And so even though I'm in a much earlier part of the journey here, I experienced in that moment a kind of fear. And I think this is almost atmospheric when it comes to aging. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand, why is there so much fear and anxiety in our culture around aging?
I think there's a tremendous amount of fear and anxiety. And as you mentioned, a lot of suffering associated with that. And I think one reason is that there's a very deep conditioning that goes on in our culture that's really quite at odds with many of the indigenous wisdom cultures throughout history. At a very early age, we start getting a message in our culture that becoming an older human being is essentially bad news, that it's a descent in quality of life, that as a person ages, they become increasingly irrelevant, and in some cases, lose cognitive capacities and physical capacities, and basically are going to be cast out by society like an old shoe, essentially, right? When I first got involved with this work of conscious aging, I wasn't that much older than you are now. I was 46 when Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi came to Naropa University where I was teaching. What was so beautiful about this man, who happened to be the age that I am now, he was 72 when he came to Naropa back in 1996. And I approached him as a 46-year-old and got to know him. And I found myself meeting someone who really celebrated being an elder. This was someone who wasn't 72 wishing he was 35 or 25. He was someone who was 72 who loved being 72. And he saw himself as a wise elder in the society with something to offer that oftentimes younger people didn't have access to. So I think part of what we're tasked with, the challenge that a lot of us have in front of us is, how do we decondition all of the pernicious and negative messages that we've been given by the society, by the media, by some of the stories in our own families in some cases, in such a way that we can actually approach growing older with a beginner's mind, with a certain openness of heart and mind that allows us to see what our actual experience is, rather than what we've been pre-programmed to experience by the society. Social psychologists, for example, have spoken for decades about what's called the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Which is a very powerful psychological and spiritual phenomenon in which if we carry a particular belief about ourselves and what's going to happen to us, there's a very good chance that we'll unconsciously create it and end up experiencing the kind of elderhood that we most fear. At the same time, if we do the kind of inner work and inner development and exploration that the contemplative practices and teachings of the world make available to us, we can come to see that a lot of what we've been told about becoming an older person is simply not true. It's a distorted and confused perspective on becoming an older person. Not that we're going to be Pollyanna-ish and deny that there are hard aspects, difficulties associated with having a body that's getting older and a mind that's aging and so on and so forth. But rather, there are also incredible treasures and riches to be had for those people who are willing to look deeply at what's happening in the process of growing older. You know? So this is where good Western psychology and psychotherapy, this is where contemplative insights and spiritual insights related to the question, who am I ultimately, beyond the level of the body and the mind? Those kinds of questions invite us to look more deeply at what's possible for us as human beings as we move into later life, and to actually celebrate what one Tibetan teacher called happiness for no reason. We can cultivate a certain kind of what another, Carl Jung once talked about what he called the laughter of the wise, who had such a perspective on the whole span of life that they could appreciate every stage of it. So it's understandable that the fear and anxiety is there. That's the bad news is that that's our basic cultural position. The good news, on the other hand, is that we can grow beyond that and disidentify with it and come to realize that we don't have to turn that into a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I love that, David. And I'm wondering if we can elaborate a little bit on the good news part of it. Mm-hmm. You know, I was listening to a talk from Ram Dass, the spiritual teacher, who we are both big fans of. And he was talking about how, you know, if you look at the media and the way they portray aging, it's always old people doing the things young people do. So, right, it's like an old person kiteboarding in Maui or snowboarding, and how this can create a kind of pernicious set of expectations where the joy of aging is really doing what 20-year-olds do. But I'm thinking that you might have a different take here. What are some of the joys or the things that one can do as we age that bring us contentment or a sense of well-being or equanimity that maybe aren't that extreme case of kiteboarding in Maui?
It seems to me that if we're willing to engage with some of the various spiritual teachings and practices that are so readily available at this time, what happens to us as we grow older is we come to understand that every single one of us is living on two levels of consciousness at the same time, right? One level we could call, Ram Dass, as you know, would call it the ego. The other level he would call the soul, for example. Different traditions give these two levels different labels. In Buddhism, we talk about the two truths, meaning the relative and the absolute. Yeah? In Western society, conventionally, we talk about the human and the divine. Yeah? Taoist philosophy in China talks about heaven and earth. Yeah? Well, most of the suffering associated with aging is related to the ego or the small self in the physical body, which is one dimension of who and what we all are that has to be embraced and fully appreciated. To the extent that we've been willing to engage with inner cultivation and spiritual teachings, we also discover this larger level of what we are, what Buddhism calls true nature or Buddha nature, what contemplative Christians call Christ consciousness, what transpersonal psychology calls our true self, capital T, capital S. Yeah? And so there's a certain kind of joy and happiness associated with understanding that we live on both of these levels and that our primary identity is the larger level. It's the Buddha nature or the true nature. It's heaven versus earth in the Chinese pairing. It's Christ consciousness versus the small self or the ego identity, as it's talked about in that tradition. Yeah? And inherent in that larger level is what biblical tradition calls the peace that surpasses understanding. There's a kind of joy and happiness that for the larger part of who we are, which ultimately can't be labeled at all, but is more real than anything we could ever experience. Yeah? There's a kind of happiness that's unconditional. So rather than buying into the cultural teaching on what happiness and joy are, which is basically something we experience as an emotion, if I get what I want, I'm happy as an ego or a small self. If I don't get what I want, I'm unhappy. Yeah. If I'm waiting for the news about a biopsy and it turns out to be negative, I'm happy. That's good news, right? And that's a wonderful kind of happiness. However, it's very conditional. It's completely subject to external conditions. Right? The joy of elderhood, as I'm coming to understand it as the days go by, is that there's a kind of happiness and well-being that we all innately have access to that is not dependent on external conditions at all, because it's a state of being rather than a temporary emotional state. To me, the real joy of becoming an older person is increasingly living more and more of the time in the place of unconditional happiness and learning to appreciate all 10,000 of the joys and sorrows on both sides of the spectrum that the Taoist teachers talk about, so that we see the mystery and the miracle and the gift of life as it actually is, and we say yes to the whole situation. Yeah. That's not something I was at all able to do as a younger person. I was like a leaf in the emotional breeze much of the time. Happy when I had just fallen in love, unhappy 2 weeks later when I fell out, right? Or whatever the situation might have been. And so for me, that's the ultimate joy for us as a human being. And it's not unattainable by younger people, but it's definitely more accessible for older people.
I love that distinction between the relative plane where things like accomplishment and what you're capable of doing matter a lot, and this absolute plane. And just as you're describing that, I can feel that there's so much more space and so much more openness in that level of the absolute. And it's almost exciting to think that as we age, we can spend more time there and we can cultivate that. I mean, that's really powerful. And I actually think that's a great segue, because I think the question a lot of people might be having now is, well, how do we do that? Sounds great. Love the idea. And what you do in the book, which I found really interesting and exciting, is that you lay out 7 essential elements of what this transition or this shift might look like, or 7 principles, you might say. And so I was curious just about, how did you come up with the list of 7 elements that you go through in the book? And And maybe you can just describe some of those for everyone
Mm-hmm.
so they have a sense of what the roadmap looks like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, the answer relates to what I said when you asked about what inspired me to write the book, actually, because when I did work with the life review process, which involved some journaling and some self-reflection and some conversations with people I respect, what I was essentially doing was looking back at my life and trying to understand it from the current perspective. When I was moving through it from, say, 21 on, or as a child on, it was quite mysterious to me as to what was happening and why. I felt a little bit like I had a blindfold on and I had my hands out, and when I bumped into a wall, I knew I should change directions. When I was looking back more recently, a few years ago, I could see that there were particular signposts along the way, and that I had, in fact, been on a path that makes a great deal more sense to me from the standpoint of being 72 than it did at 22. Yeah. And so when I sat down to write the book, I basically said to myself, could I articulate some kind of map that was about more than my personal journey, although it would have elements of that would have some universal applicability to other people who might be interested in the journey of awakening, as Ram Dass would often call it. Yeah. And so that's what I tried to do. I tried to look at how my own life had unfolded and to describe the journey like a travel log, essentially. Yeah. I started, for example, with a chapter called Embracing the Mystery. And for me, that began, as some of you know who have seen the book, when my father died when I was 13 years old, and he had a sudden massive heart attack. And my life and the life of my family, my mother and my brother and I, was quite shattered, quite unexpectedly, and there was no explanation that made sense to me. And in trying to make sense of that, I came to realize that I might not ever understand that. However, I started asking questions and feeling concerns that most people don't feel till they're 55 or 60, right? Simply because of that event. And so the mystery was the first thing I had to embrace, that even though I had a reasonably sharp intellect as a young person, I could see at 13 it was not going to be sufficient to really make sense out of this life or certain aspects of it. Yeah? And I had to surrender to that and learn how to be with that mystery without being too anxious or too frightened or too shut down, but rather to turn toward it and approach it with what I call loving curiosity and try to understand that. And the rest of the process unfolded from there, because it was out of that exploration and that loving curiosity that I began to get involved with spiritual practice. And first, I got involved with some drugs as a high school and college student, like many people coming of age in the years that I was. And it was in part a recreational activity, and it was in part a spiritual exploration of what life is all about, what the nature of consciousness is, who I was or who I wasn't, the two levels of the self that we talked about in terms of the relative and the absolute. That opened some things up for me, and yet it didn't seem like a viable spiritual path going forward that would provide any stability for me. And it was out of that exploration of what the drug culture was about that I got involved with yoga and meditation. And at that point, a whole new vision of spiritual awakening became a part of my life. And I saw how that vision functioned like a North Star. It gave me signposts. Even if I could never touch that North Star, it gave direction and purpose and meaning to my life. Yeah. So the second chapter is about creating a vision for your life, actually realizing that we can make choices to have a vision that's ennobling, a vision that takes us out of our own self-absorption and our own primary concern with ourselves, and allows us to learn how to honor ourselves in a self-compassionate and loving way, while at the same time that realizing that what really brings joy and meaning to our lives is in some way being of benefit to other living beings in the planet, whether that's human beings or non-human beings or whatever it is. Yeah. So the vision came, that's the second chapter in the book. What's the vision? What's the North Star for the way we're living? Yeah. Right. Then once the vision became clear, the question that you're bringing up, how to? I can have a vision to be a loving and wise person, but if I'm loaded with afflictive emotions and confusion and narcissism and such, it's very hard to actualize that. Right? And that's where the next chapter comes into play, which is called committing to inner work. Right? Because it's the inner work of the various contemplative and spiritual teachings that are available to all of us that actually enables us to bring to fruition what in Buddhism are called the paramitas, the perfections of the heart, meaning our best human qualities, right? Qualities like compassion, wisdom, loving kindness, generosity, patience, and so forth, right? And as a lot of us know, particularly in the last 50 years or so, with the East-West exchange we've had in this country, in terms of philosophies and psychologies and concepts of mind and heart, and with the advent of the internet, the various strategies and approaches to spiritual growth and development are more available than they've ever been in human history. That said, we still have to make wise choices about which methods and practices to work with. And that's part of the maturation process on the spiritual path. Yeah. When we do that and we start to do the inner work, we move to the next chapter of the book, which is a tricky title. The chapter is called Effective Suffering, right? Which is a pretty strange phrase, admittedly. I was put off by it when I first heard it. But the fact that it was spoken by Thomas Merton, a great contemplative I had tremendous respect for, led me to want to explore it. And this is essentially the process of realizing that from a spiritual perspective, the suffering in our lives is functional. It's not desirable. We wouldn't choose it for ourselves or anyone else. However, what we come to see is that if we have the willingness to open our hearts and the eyes to see it, our very own suffering can become a gateway to the cultivation of our compassion for others who are suffering. It's not an accident, for example, as some of you from the Boulder community have heard me say before, I became a hospice director in my early 30s. One reason being because of the losses I experienced at 13 when my father died, and subsequently some of his brothers died in a similar manner from heart attacks, suddenly and unexpectedly. Yeah. And I had a particular sensitivity to the kind of grief one experiences when there's a sudden and traumatic loss. Yeah. That suffering is what motivated me to want to work in the hospice movement and help bring it into Western society, and to spend time with people and their families when there was the loss of a loved one about to occur. Yeah. And once we see that our own suffering is not something to feel just sorry for ourselves about, but rather that it's an essential and critical part of our unfolding as conscious beings, we move to the 6th chapter of the book, which I called Serving from the Heart, because there's a kind of fulfillment that arises organically and naturally when we start to transform our own suffering into the path of what's called the wounded healer, right? That is, using our difficulties and challenges to be more skillfully able to work with others. Yeah. And then the last chapter in the book is essentially something that I referred to a little bit earlier. It's the celebratory stage in the process where we begin to actually understand that life is a gift. Every single breath, in some sense, is a gift. And none of us knows how many more breaths we're going to be gifted with, right? And the truth of the matter is, when we realize that, we can either shrink in anxiety and fear and spend our lives in distraction, or we can embrace the preciousness of the moments of our lives fully and completely with a sense of celebration and appreciation for whatever's unfolding in our lives, be it a beautiful sunset or the eyes of a grandchild we love or the dentist who's doing our root canal, frankly, right? It's all good on some level, right? So that's a little bit of an overview of how I experienced the sequencing that I chose for the book.
Love the final idea there of celebration. I was trying to just celebrate. Here we all are on this Zoom call, having this conversation from various parts of the country. And again, just bringing that attitude of celebration to each moment, even this one and the next and the next.
True.
And as we celebrate, I did want to go back to effective suffering, because I wonder if other people had a similar reaction of like, wow, that's interesting, unexpected. Want to hear a little bit more about that. So I'm wondering if we can double click there, and particularly on, there was a distinction you make around suffering. There was a real aha moment for me. There was this distinction between what you call unnecessary suffering and existential suffering. And so I'm wondering if you could just kind of lay out that distinction and maybe offer a few examples of what those two mean, because I found that just to be a really powerful insight.
Mm-hmm. That particular distinction is rooted in classical Buddhist teachings. I chose some different language than the Buddha. In the classical discourses, that distinction relates to what the Buddha called the first arrow and the second arrow. And there's a parable and a story that he tells in the discourses in which he makes the point that the first arrow, which is associated with what Buddhism calls the first noble truth, is associated with what most of us would call existential givens. Specifically, if I'm born into a human body, right, I will experience illness at some point. I will experience aging at some point, and I will experience physical death at some point. Yeah. I will experience loss and grief because of the teaching of what in Buddhism is called anicca, impermanence, right? That absolutely every phenomenon on the ultimate level is impermanent and ungraspable. And in a sense, as is often said in somewhat of a cliche, change is the only constant. When we're living in a world where change is the only constant, we're going to lose people and things that are important to us. Right? That's existential. It's not a personal problem. It's not a sign of our own inadequacy or brokenness. It's the nature of life and the world. Yeah. So those, all the suffering that we associate with aging bodies, loss of loved ones, loss of capacities, all kinds of changes that occur. Our new car gets hit in the parking lot. It's no longer shiny and beautiful, right? All of these losses, that's, in my vocabulary, that's how it is. When the Buddha said, life involves suffering, that's the first noble truth. And that's what's associated with this idea of existential suffering. Those kinds of experiences are not completely avoidable. They're inherent in the life process. Yeah? So then what is unnecessary suffering, or what the Buddha called the second arrow in the discourses? Right? That has to do with how we respond to the existential suffering that we experience. Yeah. An example, I've been fairly athletic throughout my life. When I was in my early 50s, one of the things I reveled in and just celebrated was early morning runs in the mountains here in Boulder. Yeah. However, I was starting to have a lot of pain in my knees. So at a certain point, I felt it was time to get them examined. I went to the Boulder Center for Sports Medicine, and I had a workup, and the physician I was working with put up the x-ray of my knees, and it was completely obvious what was going on. Right? The cartilage in both knees was worn down close to the bone. Perhaps because my body wasn't perfectly balanced and I'd done a lot of running, the cartilage is what absorbs the heel strike when you run, and that's why you can run without pain. But as that cartilage got thinner and more worn, I was having more pain. Yeah. I acted like I didn't understand the x-ray because I so didn't want to hear what he was going to say to me. Right? And I looked at this doctor and I said, can you tell me in lay terms what we're looking at here? Right? And he'd obviously spoken to 10,000 aging Boulder runners. And he looked at me with a genuinely compassionate smile and he said to me, let me put it this way. Cartilage is like tire tread. When it's gone, it's gone. And then he smiled and he said, I hope you like swimming and biking, right? Because those don't have the heel strike. Yeah. Now, that was an existential event in the sense that bodies change, right? However, the depression and the upset I had for about the next 6 or 8 months was the add-on. Why me? I'm only 51. That's not fair. I've taken such good care of myself. I take supplements. I eat well, right? I went through that whole process and I could see how I could hike and do most things, but when people ran by me on the trail when I was walking up a mountain, I felt jealous. I felt envious that I couldn't do what I used to do and they could. Yeah, right. That's what I mean by unnecessary suffering. Had I a deeper understanding and embrace of the existential reality of an aging body, I perhaps might have been a little more able to spend maybe 2 weeks instead of 6 or 8 months with that extra layer of grief, that adventitious suffering, so to speak. That's kind of a concrete example. Does it give you a sense of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's so helpful. And I'm hoping everybody else got a aha there as well. I think that's a really powerful insight. And one more question, because I do think it would be great to get some questions from the audience here. I'm sure you have questions or thoughts percolating, so be sure to put those into the chat. But David, one last question for you about how we make this practical, because these are huge ideas you're laying out, amazing ideas. And it leaves me wondering, first of all, how do you put some of this into practice in your life? But then second, for the rest of us, are there 1 or 2 things we could be doing every day to begin taking some baby steps toward this shift that you're describing in the book?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are a lot of different things that we can all do. And to some extent, it's a matter of each of us exercising our intuition about what from that menu we want to choose. Yeah. One thing I would definitely choose that I think applies to all of us as human beings, particularly in our Western society, is to explore ways to cultivate self-compassion. Right? The other pandemic in our culture that doesn't get spoken about much, that's been with us my entire life and for longer than that, is a certain pandemic of perfectionism and self-criticism. And most of us carry an inner critic that's quite mean-spirited and brutal in some ways, and it varies from individual to individual. Yeah. But there's a whole different variety of ways that we can cultivate self-compassion. For example, the loving kindness practices in the Buddhist tradition are designed, in fact, to help us understand that our compassion for others is not really authentic unless we are able to have compassion for ourselves. Yeah. So there's a whole set of practices there called metta practice, translated as loving kindness or unconditional friendliness toward ourselves. And practicing some version of that can be helpful. Prayers and practices of forgiveness, reviewing our day and our life, and looking at how we're living as what I call a compassionate witness rather than a critic, can be very helpful. Yeah. Sometimes talking with a compassionate friend, a counselor, a therapist, a close friend, a mentor of some sort, someone who mirrors back to us that there's a fundamental sacredness about who and what we are, just as we are, and that our lives don't need to be an ongoing self-improvement project. Yeah? I think that's extremely helpful. Yeah? In addition to that, any of the mind quieting practices, since our culture is so overstimulating in many ways, especially since the cell phone and the internet came into the picture. Anything that helps us to settle our hearts and minds, the way snowflakes in a snow globe settle when you stop shaking the snow globe and put it down on a table, I would highly recommend. That could be a prayer practice, a meditation practice of one kind or another. Walking in nature can be extremely helpful. Something that allows us to settle back into the moment. Something as simple as taking 3 slow, intentional, deep breaths, for example, and settling into the moment versus toppling headlong into a busy day. Yeah, those are a few thoughts, because that could be my second book that you're asking about right now. Yeah.
Well, I love that. And I just want to thank you once more, David, for writing this book, for bringing this into the world. I learned so much, and I highly recommend it to everyone. And now I want to turn it over to Rachel and Dafydd for audience questions.
Great.
Thank you so much, Nate and David. We really appreciate it. I've got a question to start, David, and that is, do you have any particular practices, do you think, that sort of help you pull yourself away from when you're giving yourself unnecessary suffering, or being too much of a self-critic, that you can sort of recognize that when you're doing that?
Mm-hmm. Any practice that helps you cultivate awareness. The idea here is that the unnecessary suffering is most painful and difficult when we're unconsciously identified with it and we're lost in it, so to speak, or we make it real. Yeah. So it could be something like breath meditation, right, in which we notice our thoughts and we notice our emotions and our bodily sensations, but we don't get swept away by them in a certain sense. Yeah. For other people, it might be journal writing, from this standpoint that I a moment ago called a compassionate witness, right? Because that in Western psychology, we call that metacognition with one T, meaning we have a capacity for one part of the mind to observe how the rest of the mind is functioning. Yeah? And that's also the quality of awareness that enables us to disidentify completely with the story that we're telling ourselves, the narrative or the thought that's repeating like a cement mixer and so forth, right? So I think sitting meditation practices are particularly helpful in that regard, but writing can be helpful. And in the same sense, as I talked about a little bit ago, talking to a counselor or a therapist or friend who's capable of being a compassionate witness and not judging us for our suffering, there's a kind of transmission that occurs, and there's a kind of healing that goes on in those kinds of exchanges.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And actually guiding my thinking a lot of, I'm like Nate, one of the younger folks here and thinking about things that can be done to prepare for changes coming down the pike. So thank you for that. I would love to hear, and audience, please type any questions that you have into the chat, but I would love to hear a bit about how the pandemic has shaped your teaching practice. I know that you have a lot of work that you've had to really shift in the last couple of years.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it cured me of my aversion to Zoom. As someone who's been most of my life a little bit of a Luddite in regard to technology, I suspect I might have been Amish in a previous birth, but I'm not sure. I had a certain aversion to the internet and Zoom in particular. I'd been asked at various times along the way to teach online courses, for example, and I had always chosen not to. However, it was pretty clear to me that in March of 2 years ago, when the pandemic became a reality we were all living with, we chose to move our meditation community online. And I was fortunate to have a daughter who's very sophisticated about technology and a friend in our meditation community who runs a computer company. And each of them took one of my hands and said, "You can do this." Yeah. And we moved ourselves online, and we started a 7-day-a-week daily morning sit with a group of teachers I organized and asked if they would participate. And we continued to teach our weekly groups and classes and our discussion groups and Kalyanamita groups of spiritual friends online. So that was a huge change for me. And it really did cure me. I'm so grateful that our community and so many other communities have had the opportunity to stay connected with Zoom as a vehicle. And that was a major change for me. The other thing that happened is that my life got much busier, actually, than it had been prior to the pandemic, because I'm in a role where I do a lot of life coaching and spiritual counseling and direction with individuals. And the collective level of distress in the society shot way, way up. There was a tremendous amount of grief that people were dealing with, and fear and anxiety and upset. And although I tended to be fairly busy generally before the pandemic, the whole situation up-leveled and got quite a bit more demanding. And most of the time that was a joy, even though it was very painful, because I felt like the training I've done and the skills I've been trained to use were being put to really good use. And that made my heart feel good, even though there was a lot of suffering involved. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, there's a saying in India that I've always appreciated. They say, when you do God's work, the work does itself. And I can't say that I felt like that 24/7 for the last couple of years. However, I can say that when I look at what's unfolded in our meditation community and what I've seen my colleagues in the teaching community doing over these last 2 years, it's been really beautiful to see how people have come out of the woodwork and how people have made teachings available, regardless of ability to pay in many cases, and how we've come together to support one another and care for one another during what for me has been probably the most challenging 2 years in my life, if I'm honest. Yeah. So it's been a profound time in that sense. And while I grieve all of the difficulties and the suffering, I simultaneously celebrate and have a lot of gratitude for the ways in which our collective challenges have brought out the best in many people that I've worked with and seen, and people that I know. Yeah. So let's see.
I'm afraid we are just about out of time, but there is one last question here from Carol, and she was asking if you could talk about the Tonga that you have hanging behind you there.
Oh, yeah. It's a story. That's true. When I was living in Nepal in the late 1980s, I was training with primarily with one Tibetan Buddhist teacher. Um, and it was a marvelous experience. And he's one of the people I referred to earlier when I said I wrote this book partly out of gratitude to my teachers. And there was one night when I had a dream in which I couldn't physically see myself, but I could see in the dream what I was seeing out of my eyes. And in the dream, I was way, way out in outer space, looking back at the earth. And between where I was in outer space and the earth, there was a translucent circular image, like the one in the center of this tanka. Yeah. And it was a shimmering rainbow of colors, so that when I looked through it, I saw the rainbow colors cast onto the earth. And in that moment, one of the most important realizations of my life occurred that's very hard to put into words, but I had some very deep, on the level of bone marrow deep realization that my life and the whole universe was a kinetic field of energy, and that it had no beginning and no end, even though the individual forms associated with it did. And something radically new and different arose in my consciousness that I'm not able to put words to, frankly. But it was a very important moment. Yeah. The next morning, I had been out shopping for a different tanka to do a particular practice associated with Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion. I went into a shop in Tamil, this one section of Kathmandu, and when I opened the door, this tanka was on the wall facing me, and it was the exact same image that had been in my dream the night before. Right? And I looked at it, and I was completely stunned. It was the same image. Yeah. And my first thought was, God, I hope that's not too expensive, because I have to have that tanka, you know? And I proceeded to purchase it. And to this day, when I see it in my office on a day-to-day basis, it's a touch point for me with that primal insight and realization that's wordless, but nonetheless transformative in my life. So there you are, Carol. That's the tanka story. Yeah.
So we are just about out of time, but there was one last, I think, very brief and very important question that came in from Pamela asking, can anyone be part of your online meditations?
Yes, absolutely. If you just go to my website, which is davidchernikoff.com, just my name.com, there's a section there that says online Sangha, and it has information about how to do that. I would say you might want to just email me if you're interested in getting involved, or most of the events are drop-in our community. The daily morning sits are drop-in from 8 o'clock to 8:45 a.m. Mountain Time, and they generally involve about a 25 to 30-minute meditation period and a 15-minute talk that the teachers have dubbed a dharmet, basically, right? And then my weekly group meets on Tuesday nights from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock Mountain Time. There are various other groups. We have about 8 or 9 teachers associated with our extended community. You can also look at that website. So you can look at davidchernikoff.com. There's also a website which is insightcolorado.org. Or you can email me. But we'd love to have any of you who I'm new to. Please feel free to drop into any of our activities. Almost all of them are done on a donation basis and affordable to anyone who's sincerely interested. Great.
David, Nate, thank you so much. This has been a terrific evening. We really appreciate it. You can order Life Part 2 and the 8080 Marriage at northshire.com. And we hope to see you at another Northshire Presents virtual event soon. Everyone have a great evening.
Thanks to all of you, and thanks to both of you, for all three of you, for hosting. Nate, much gratitude to you, and thanks to all of you who chose to be here today. Be well.
Thank you so much, and have a great night, everybody.
Mm-hmm.